Good evening. Princeton professor Peter Singer begins his 2009 book, The Life You Can Save, with an analogy. Suppose that you're on your way to work and you're passing a pond that sometimes children play in. The pond is only knee-deep, but you see a toddler in the pond who's drowning. Now, if you take time out of your day to save this child, you're going to make your clothes dirty, and you're probably going to be late to work. Do we have a moral obligation to save this child? Peter Singer says that yes, and the obvious answer to most college students is that yes, we have a moral obligation to save this child, even if it ruins our clothes and makes us late for work. Now, what makes this interesting and perhaps a little more controversial is that he makes a similar argument with foreign aid. He says that we in the first world have a moral duty to lend money in the equivalent of what would save one life here to people in the third world. So I accept his parable and I'd like to raise him one. Okay, so this time you're walking by a lake and you see two children drowning, and you know that if you swim you can only save one child, but you see a motorboat and you know that if you get in the motorboat and drive around the lake, you can save both children. Now, what makes this interesting is that you've never driven a motorboat before, and you're scared. You have a phobia, let's say, of driving motorboats. Now, would you argue that you should still get in the motorboat and save both children? I think the obvious answer is that yes, you have to answer this in the affirmative. Even if it makes you uncomfortable, you should get in the motorboat and save both children. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that just because we realize that we have an obligation to the life we can save, that doesn't mean that all ways of saving lives are created equal. Indeed, what do invisible children, almost all awareness-raising campaigns, Scientology's Volunteers Ministry, Habitat for Humanity, at the Boys Choir of Harlem, and Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity have in common? If you look at it dollar for dollar, these are some of the least effective ways to fight international poverty. We shouldn't expect effective charity to be easy, or for that matter, sexy. In fact, we might expect it to be decidedly unsexy. With this in mind, here are some good rules of thumb. The number one thing that we should expect from an effective charity technique is for it to have high marginal impact. Mosquito nets are a case in point. They address a pressing need connected to mortality and the quality of life. Research shows that for a $2,000 investment, we can prevent 33 cases of malaria. That's one life saved and 32 lives lengthened. And when we think about, for instance, the Invisible Children campaign, there was $15 million spent in 2010, 11, and 12. And we might say, well, that's just one person's money. But we shouldn't think of it that way. What we should instead think of is the 8,000 lives that were lost, that we could have saved had we redirected it towards more efficient uses. It also includes 300,000 cases of malaria that we did not prevent because we spent it making a documentary. Now, rule number 2 is that if you have a new idea, it's extremely important to check that your idea doesn't already exist. There are literally hundreds of stories of students in high school who are applying to Ivy League universities who want to start new charities, not because of the impact that it will have, but because they want to show up as a leader. But the tragic truth is that for most of us, the best thing we can do is work in an already existing charity. And the worst thing we could do is to duplicate efforts on something that already exists. So these are 3 sites which rank charities, and Philanthropedia includes the list of almost every charitable effort that has ever been engaged in, including which ones failed and which ones succeeded. So this would allow you to check to make sure that you're not simply duplicating another person's effort. Now, the third rule is that you should make use of your brain, and you should make use of the resources you have. The gains from specialization and the principle of comparative advantage don't disappear when the topic changes to charitable giving. Volunteering on a construction site where you could barely hold a hammer is very unlikely to help, and in many cases is more of a burden. In 2010, for instance, Haiti banned foreign doctors from entering the country because they believed that, number one, the foreign doctors couldn't communicate in the local language, which caused a lot of problems, and number two, they interfered with the local economy for doctors. They did the same thing with food, where it was a real tragedy because food filled up the warehouses and crowded out other needed development supplies. One of the interesting things about this is that we believe that in our own lives, we know how to spend our money better than any organization. But when it comes to the poor people in Africa, we believe that we should choose what they spend their money on. One of the most effective ways of giving is something called GiveDirectly.org. And they just directly wire money to people in Kenya. And what they find is that if you wire money to men, what they spend the money on is home improvements. And they don't spend the money on alcohol, although some people have claimed this. They don't spend the money on entertainment, although some people have claimed this. The vast majority of the money goes into home improvements and has a 20% return, which means that if you send them $1, they're going to get $1.20 the next year from savings and from investing in their home. If you've dedicated your life to becoming the best iBanker in the world, taking a 2-week respite to build homes in Georgia is unlikely to be the best use of your time. You're much better off simply donating the money you would have made during that 2 weeks to a charitable organization that we already know can make a big difference in people's lives. So, part of this talk was, for me, to introduce a new idea, something that no one has proposed before, but that I believe would have some high marginal impact, and that would really make use of the talents that we have in this university. So, there are 7,000 languages on this earth. And if you look at the way those languages are distributed over the population, 3 billion people speak only around 20 languages. 4 billion people speak languages that are going to disappear over the next 100 years. And part of that is because these people are going to move to the cities and find that they can't use their languages. They can't get jobs. They're going to be denied opportunities. In particular, they're denied access to the internet and really all software. And one of the interesting things is that every time I bring this up, no one can believe it. But the reason that we don't know about it is because it gets lost in translation, because there's literally no way for these people to interact with us. In particular, OpenOffice, which is the #1 writing suite for people who live in the developing world and the third world, is only available in 60 languages. It leaves 5 billion people behind. Mozilla Firefox is even worse. It leaves, I think, about 5.5 billion people behind. And by translating these already existing tools into local languages, we can enable people who would otherwise be destroyed by urbanization and industrialization to have a fighting chance, in the new internet economy. So, I have a message in particular for the students of Princeton, which is that when you give, you should think about how you're giving. In many cases, what you're doing with your time would be better spent making that money and giving it to charity. And I have a special message for the administrators of Princeton. We fund literally dozens of post-graduation service projects, and I've done some research over the past few weeks which suggests that the vast majority of those service projects go into the creation, funding, and founding of startups which disappear in a few years because of the aforementioned problems. I believe that we have a real duty to fight poverty, and when we're funding these service organizations, we shouldn't be treating them as a method for salvation in the case of religiously oriented people, or lines on our CV. Princeton's motto is that we're in the service of our nation and in the service of all nations, and I believe that we should do that effectively. Thank you.